This place was so notorious, it came to be known as Canada's Alcatraz. Who died? How did they die? Where are they buried? And why have their graves gone unmarked for so long?
That is a clip from the video trailer for Kuper Island. It's an upcoming CBC audio podcast. So it's about the Indian residential school on a southern Gulf island. And it's hosted by our next guest, who you may recognize from his days as a Vancouver-based TV reporter. He was also the host of Cross Country Checkup. So Duncan McCue joins us from Toronto. Duncan, welcome.
Good to be here, Gloria.
Yeah, it's so good to see you too. How did this podcast come about?
Remember last summer, Gloria, when the news of unmarked graves was starting to, at residential schools, was starting to go right across the country. And it just seemed like school after school after school was announcing that they had graves on their former residential school properties. There was one announcement from Penelakut which caught my eye because, as you just mentioned, I'd been a reporter in BC for 20 years, and Penelakut announced that there were unmarked graves at the Kuper Island residential school. I had heard a lot of awful things about what had happened at the Kuper Island school. And so it caught my eye. And, this is a school that in its first 30 years of existence, nearly 40% of the children died. This is a school that survivors have referred to as Alcatraz because the school was on an island and it was impossible for children to get away from. Yet they kept on trying. I mean, you have to ask what was so bad about that place that children were running away into the Salish Sea to get away from it. So it was a story that I felt just needed to be told, and a podcast seemed like a perfect way to do it.
Well, sure. So, I mean, what was your motivation, I guess, for going right there, talking to these people, telling their stories?
I made one call early on, talked to the former chief of Penelakut, and she told me a story that just, it made the hairs on the back of my neck raise up, Gloria. She talked about how when the school was torn down in 1975, the community members started sensing the spirits of children. The children spirits were reaching out, touching them, appearing in windows, crying out. There was a sense of spiritual anguish in the place. And that's been happening in Penelakut for decades now. When I heard that, I just thought, this is not something that just showed up in the headlines last year, graves. This is something that Penelakut has been struggling with, how to make things right ever since the school closed down. And Penelakut, it has been dealing with it in spiritual ways, which is part of what we get into in the podcast. But also, they were far ahead of everybody else in terms of bringing in ground-penetrating radar to try to locate the body of their missing children. And they've been doing that work since 2014, really leading the way. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the pain that has brought up for Penelakut, but also some of the way forward.
So, Duncan, what can you do in a podcast that you couldn't do in another format, a TV or radio news story?
One of the things about podcasting, and podcasts have exploded, in the past couple of years, especially during the pandemic. People want that audio experience. Podcasts are intimate, and that's really a way to try to connect with listeners. But when you look into this kind of burgeoning podcast market, there's very little about residential schools. And last summer, we saw so many Canadians who were surprised or even shocked by the fact that so many children had died at residential schools, and they wanted to learn more. And if they wanted to hear a podcast about it, there weren't many places to turn. So that's why we decided the time was right for an in-depth look at deaths at residential school. This is grim. This is it's not just a dark chapter in Canada's history, Gloria. This is, I would argue, our whole story. And it's something that the country needs to grapple with. But also, First Nations people right across this country are trying to figure out how to memorialize their children that never came home. And so, as I said, there are lessons to be learned, and Penelakut was very generous in sharing them with us.
Well, as you point out, the stories are grim. It's raw. And as an Indigenous journalist covering this, how does it feel to work on this podcast?
When I agreed to do this, Gloria, at the beginning, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. This is dark. But as I said, it's a story that needs to be told. I'm an Indigenous journalist, and here's the truth of the matter, Gloria. If Canada had its way, I may not be here. That was the whole point of residential schools, was to get rid of Indians. And so I think people need to hear that. But also, I'll just say one other thing. A podcast it's not just one quick interview that lasts 5 minutes. It lasts months and months and months. And we were spending a lot of time with families talking about deaths and abuse at the Kuper Island school. And I knew that was potentially very traumatic for them. And so as an Indigenous journalist, it was important for me to make sure that I wasn't causing more harm, that I wasn't hurting them more by picking around in their memories about these painful times, but that we were sharing truths and hopefully looking for a way forward in a way that was positive and healing for everybody. So that was heavy. It was heavy to build that relationship with the people in our podcast, but I know that what's going to shine through for them is the same thing that just shone through for me, which is the courage. Just the courage of the survivors who are sharing their story, both about what happened to them at the school and what happened to them in their families as well after the school, but also the courage of people to stand up and say, this system was wrong. Throughout the history of Indian residential schools, there were Canadians who stood up and said, this is wrong. Whether it was Dr. Bryce back in the 1920s who wrote a pamphlet called A National Crime because so many children were dying, whether it was Dolores Flans, who was a supervisor who's in our podcast, who witnessed sexual abuse happening and told her supervisor, and then ultimately ended up testifying in a criminal trial. There were Canadians all along who acknowledged that this was wrong, and yet the system continued. So I think people need to reflect on that, what it means for our country. But I also hope, as they're listening, that the courage of the people that are in our podcast really shines through.
Duncan, I'm so glad you've done this. Thank you very much. We look forward to listening.
Miigwech, Gloria, and it's really good to see you, and hi to all the viewers in British Columbia. Miss you.
Now, stories about residential schools can be unsettling, and if you or anyone you know needs support, you can access emotional and crisis referral services by calling the 24-hour residential school crisis line. That's 1-866-925-4419.